Identity is a crucial aspect of a country's national security. It has a key role in preventing terrorism, stop illegal immigration, and assist in law enforcement. Our first session, Biometrics, Enhancing National Security, will shed some light on how biometric impact and increase national security. Our next speaker is Mr. Patrick Nemeth, Director at the Office of Biometric Identity Management, Identity Operations Division, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Nemeth's responsibilities include managing and delivery of current identity services through operation of the Automated Border Identification System, IDENT. Please welcome Patrick for his presentation on improving Homeland Security through identity. Patrick.
Boy, they start that promptly. I'm already down 10 seconds. As you heard, my name is Pat Nemeth, and I have to keep practicing this. I am the Division Director for Identity Operations for the Office of Biometric Identity Management within the National Protection and Programs Directorate of the Department of Homeland Security. The reason I practice that is I occasionally find myself in court testifying in identity fraud cases, and I find that if I can make it through there without stuttering or getting stuck, the jury just believes everything else I say. So, first of all, I'd like to thank Roy and Yasmin for their courtesy and cooperation in getting everything together for this, and Nama, who met with us in London in October and convinced us that we had to be here. I appreciate that. If you have any really hard questions for me today, I have a couple of other folks from OBIM who I'll probably defer them to. I've got Mike Wyckoff, who is in our technology modernization and awareness section, and Ken Holt in our international sharing coordination. And in case I say anything really stupid or against U.S. policy, I have my public affairs officer who will be waving wildly at me. First of all, we too are in the same directorate as our cyber folks and our infrastructure protection folks. We struggle with how all of those things connect. It sounds like Israel has done a better job so far at integrating their national vision, at least as far as it comes to their identity. We have lots of agencies in the United States, and they all compete for some of the same territory, so we're constantly working on that, and we have yet to have a national vision for biometrics, but we continue to discuss that. I'm representing the Department of Homeland Security, which is not criminal justice, and it's not the defense guys, but it's pretty much the rest of the gamut. In the upper left-hand quadrant of this chart, you'll see my distillation of why we do biometrics in the Department of Homeland Security. There are 100-page documents that will tell you this. I distill it down to these three things. It's to identify the good guys who need to be facilitated along in whether they're entering the country or applying for a benefit or a credential. It's to identify bad guys, and it's to identify people who have changed their persona, their biographic identity for some reason. Sometimes it's good, they got married and they changed their name. Sometimes they happen to have two different passports based on dual citizenship, but they always require an extra look. Down at the bottom left, you'll see where we fit as the Office of Biometric Identification. If you look at the entire biometric spectrum from the time you collect the biometric to the time you decide what you're going to do with it, we're that middle part. We don't collect it at the airport, we get it after that. We do the matching and decide what information goes along with that, and we push it back to the frontline officers who can then decide whether or not they have to take any particular action. In the upper right, you'll see our three mission essential functions for the Office of Biometric Identity Management. We operate a large system that does primarily fingerprint matching, but over the last 2 years we've added face and iris. We do manual verification. I have 65 fingerprint examiners who work for me, so that if someone gets stuck at an airport or a land port or an immigration office because their fingerprints don't match or there's some other issue, the fingerprint examiners have 10 minutes to solve that dilemma. And then the third one is coordination for sharing. The people who collect the information in the United States own it from cradle to grave. We're the stewards of the information. We need their permission to share it. 99% of the time, that permission's already been granted in an automated fashion, but in certain circumstances, particularly when we're doing international sharing, we have to go back to the data owner and find out if it's okay for us to release that information. In the bottom right-hand side, you'll see our fingerprint growth. And if you looked at it and could actually read all those numbers, what you would see is over the past 7 years, we've doubled the number of transactions that have passed through our system. If you extend it out another 7 years based on what we know from organic growth and from new mission areas and agencies coming on board, you'll see that it's going to double again. So biometrics are alive and well. They're continuing to expand. Operators are finding new ways to enhance their mission by doing it. We just have to do it smartly as we move along. This does not account for the explosion in facial technology that's been happening over the last 2 years or so, and the department is moving into that in a number of ways, which those of you who visit the United States will see in the near future if you haven't already at some of our airports. It's a risk-benefit decision. Obviously, face does not rise to the same level as of 2018 as fingerprints do, but we can move people through a lot quicker, and you don't have to have as many officers, and the subjects don't have to understand how to put their hand down on a scanner in order for you to have your picture taken. This represents all of our customers, and I'll go into the Department of Homeland Security customers here in a minute, but if you took nothing else away from my presentation, it would be that biometrics is a holistic game. Biometrics does not equal border, and border does not equal airports. Frequently, when we go into public, everyone wants to talk about airports because that's where the money is for vendors. But in order to have an effective system and be able to identify people, you have to collect biometrics, we believe, when you do visa applications, when you do border entry, when you do immigration applications, if there are interior arrests for enforcement actions, if you're doing credentialing for sensitive areas, all of those things play into each other to be able to identify, should that person get that credential, should they be in the country, should they be allowed to come back in the future. And as you see, we look at it as a government holistic approach. There are 3 major systems in the United States. For those of you who have dealt with the United States, that probably isn't going to surprise you because we have multiple agencies doing what looks like the same mission frequently. But the 3 big systems, the Department of Defense, which does primarily overseas collection, battlefields, and bases. They've got about 10 million unique identities in their database. You've got the Department of Justice, which the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, takes care of, about 80 million criminal identities and maybe 30 million civil. And you've got the Department of Homeland Security, which has 230 million unique identities, about 800 million encounters, and about 13 million people on our watch list. The numbers usually surprise people. We look at it like we're doing production line biometrics. We don't have a lot of time to spend on it. We have to make the call quickly and use technology as much as possible. But we facilitate sharing between all of those different players so that particularly for the derogatory information, terrorist and criminal information, it's shared between all of the players. This is my system, IDENT, which stands for the Automated Biometric Identification System. I wasn't there when they named it. It's IDENT. It's been out since it was built in 1994 and fielded in 1995, so it's a little long in the tooth, and I'll talk in a minute about the replacement system that's coming. Up to, we've gone as high as 429,000 transactions in a single day. Usually we're in somewhere in the 300,000 transactions per day. So we're moving a lot of data, which means we have to be very careful about our data access rules and all of our sharing agreements with our various agencies. This represents our major customers, and there are obviously submissions underneath each one of those. The State Department, 40,000 visas in a typical day, usually 40,000 to 50,000. Border entry, as you see. USCIS, Citizen and Immigration Service, the immigration guys, very interesting agency when you look at the numbers of applications they're doing every day. We're also, for them, looking at voice, because they get about 50,000 phone calls a day, mostly people wanting to know what's the status of their naturalization or their resident alien application, and they would like to automate that rather than having to hire people to answer the phone, look up the record, and give them the answer to that. They're also the agency that has the highest percentage of derogatory information on people that come to them. You would think the border would, but a lot of those folks get filtered out at the visa point. So when you go to a Citizen and Immigration Center, you're more likely than any of our other customers to flag for known or suspected terrorist or wanted criminal or any of those other things, which fascinates me, that people who know that they're wanted or are on the terrorist list would show up and willingly give their biometrics along with an address that we can find them at. But it's good for us. And international sharing, which I'll talk about in a minute too. You'll see some of the other folks down further. As you descend down to the Transportation Security Administration, another interesting one that they're just slowly coming on board and building their systems. We're only doing some of their credentialing areas for them right now, but in particularly pre-check, trusted traveler program, and also for the transportation worker identification cards, truck drivers, longshoremen who have access to sensitive ports. But little by little, they're adding all of their other populations, hazardous materials, aviation security workers, those sorts of things. The other interesting one on there is the emergency management folks, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Administration. Whenever there's a natural disaster, they deploy their folks and they contract a lot of people and they get a lot of volunteers to help with hurricanes or fires, those sorts of things. What they found was that taking fingerprints and mailing them off to the FBI and getting a criminal background check that got mailed back to them in about 2 weeks wasn't really working for them. By that point, they had already given access to government equipment, funds, victims of disasters, and so we gave them the capability to do it on the fly out in the field and get a response within 2 hours from us, and we facilitate and aggregate that answer from both agencies. Our international sharing. We've been doing international sharing with what we call the Five Eyes for about 10 years now. The United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. We're still waiting for the UK to go automatic, but the others all have automated systems, and so the numbers are escalating on this. We find, because this is primarily in the area of asylum and refugees, that there are asylum shoppers in the world. In one case from a couple years ago, we had an individual receiving immigration, 4 sets of immigration benefits in 3 different countries under those 4 different identities. So we're looking for those people who have are asylum shopping, and for people who say that they've never been to another country, that they're fleeing their country, and yet somehow they managed to visit London and Toronto before they got to the United States or Sydney, primarily those areas. We're also doing criminal sharing with them and deportation sharing. A couple of years ago, somebody got the great idea that before we deport someone, perhaps we should tell the receiving country that they committed all of these particular crimes while they were here. So we now package that up and we provide that information to them. More recently, starting about 1.5 years ago, we've been adding European countries to that. After the terrorist attacks in Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Nice, you probably could name a few others, the President and the Secretary of Homeland Security offered vetting assistance to European countries for their migrant flow. Some of them have agreed. Some are still trying to figure out how to do that, and not surprisingly, some have said, thank you, we got it. So we brought Greece on board 1.5 years ago. It's not a huge number, but it's a very high percentage of derogatory information that we're hitting on with them because they're being selective about who they send. In Mexico, which is our southern neighbor, we're seeing huge matches on as people flow in from Central America into southern Mexico, which is a route from the Middle East into South America and up. High correlations on match rates from that area, which is kind of intriguing. It means that they've either been to the United States before, or they've encountered the State Department or the Department of Defense overseas before, and yet they're choosing to make this long manual walking and bus ride up through Mexico that takes about 10 days. We're able to get those matches and provide that information to our border stations so that when that person shows up, they know exactly who he is and what information we have on him, rather than allowing safety of the officers to be affected. And then we're in various stages with Bulgaria, Argentina, Italy, and Croatia right now. I would be remiss, and I would certainly be attacked, right, if I didn't mention privacy. Up until very recently, I had a slide that talked only about privacy, and a short time ago, I was sitting there thinking that privacy is not our biggest problem right now. We've got a good policy process. We were the first program within the Department of Homeland Security after it stood up to have its own privacy office. I have 3 levels of privacy offices that I have to get approval from to do virtually anything. If you look at the left-hand side, the fair information practices, proportionality, are we using it as we said we were going to, all of those things. We pay a lot of attention to that. It slows us down a lot, but it's a good discussion. The revelation for me was that privacy doesn't mean anything if we can't address the cyber end of things, because we can lock it up tight, but if anyone can hack into it, I am one of those 5 million people who lost their fingerprints through the Office of Personnel Management. In fact, I have 3 different monitoring services from 3 different compromises right now that are watching my credit rating. Did I ever mention that? So within cyber, after the fact, it seems like an obvious thing, but for our new system that we're working on, the department had a new rule, and we're the first, because when we asked them, how do we do this, they said, we don't know, just do it, and you'll be the standard setter, to do what we call a TAVA, a threat assessment and vulnerability analysis, although I might have switched the A's. And as part of that, what's new is, rather than just looking at our own system, we were required to look at all of the feeder systems, all of those other agencies that send us data and receive our data, and look at what their vulnerabilities were and what they were passing to us, because that was deemed as the biggest threat that we had. You know, you've got the insider threat and the privacy stuff, but we can only control within our borders. But if we allow those other agencies to come in and compromise it, then everything we've done is meaningless. Our new system, HART, the Homeland Advanced Recognition Technology. I also wasn't there when the name was selected. Our current system was designed in 1994, fielded in 1995. It's been band-aided, stretched, and redone every way we can based on a mid-90s architecture. We had to replace it as the requirements for faster throughput, more accuracy kept growing. So HART is that system. We just contracted for it in February. It finally got started in March. And what this slide attempts to represent is that it's a modular system. Rather than requiring coders to be on full-time to get in there and rewrite code every time we want to make any change to it, this will allow us to address just the pieces that we need to. When I first arrived in my job 6 years ago, they asked me to do an analysis, and I came back and told them, although they didn't like the answer, was that we were a 2-year organization living in a 6-month world. It took us 2 years to make any significant change based on a customer request. But customers were expecting everything in 6 months. I'm proud to say that we're now a 6-month organization living in a 2-month world. So those of you who have this problem understand what I'm saying, that operators want it and they want it now. They don't want to wait 6 months anymore. So our new system It's a 4-increment system because no one would give us the money to do it all at one time. Each increment is roughly 18 months long. The first increment, which is underway now, rebuilds the current system using modern technology, and that will be due out on, Travis over there, my public affairs officer, likes to say Valentine's Day next year because it is the heart system. And you can see some of the other additional stuff it adds. Increment 2 takes what we have now for our multimodal approach, which added face and iris, and puts it all into an integrated package rather than just bolted on to the exterior of the system as it is now, and it adds intelligent fusion. And we've left that wide open for the contractor to tell us what is the best way to fuse it. We're not happy with the score-based fusion and some of the other fusion techniques that we've seen that are currently in use, so we're hoping that they'll be a little more innovative in that approach. So that's what's currently under contract. And if there are any vendors in the room, I always like to say you should be focused on increments 3 and 4, which deal with reporting, analysis, web portal, data warehousing, better interaction with the customers, person centricity, because those are the things we're looking at now and that we're interested in what's the state of the art and available in industry right now. Okay, so heart, from the technical side, I'm just scanning to see if I'm going to lose people talking the technical side. Core service-oriented architecture. My program manager for this likes to say that it's a flexible, adaptable, scalable system. And I said, yeah, of course it is. And are we going to be the first people in the world to ever contract one and say, no, we don't want that. We want something that can't expand and can't adapt. So we put a high focus on being able to stay with this system for some time by changing little bits of it through microservices and allowing it to be modular. The biggest change, and the one that concerns most people back home, and certainly most privacy analysts, is that this is going to be a cloud-native system. It will be in Amazon Web Service, in the FISMA or FedRAMP FISMA Gov Cloud. So it's got a lot of security on it, but since we don't have a lot of history with government data in the cloud, it scares people. We're working hard with the cyber folks and with the privacy folks and with the IT folks to make sure that we do this right. We're also looking hard at the cyber resilience and making sure that rather than the 1990 system that required us to take outages for maintenance and other things, that we never have to do that again, because every time we bring our system down, consulates around the world stop interviewing applicants because they can't get their fingerprint results back. The border has to go back to the old way of doing things, where you rely on an individual officer being in a good mood when you approach him and recognizing whether you're a threat or not. And the immigration offices just stop processing them if they can't do the verifications on them. So a quick list of the things we're looking at for challenges and issues going forward. As you saw by our numbers, we're doing high volume, high speed use of biometrics. So we have to be very careful that it doesn't adversely affect people if we get it wrong. So the easiest way of doing that is don't get it wrong. But then putting in those mitigations that allow for redress and for appeals and for on-the-spot corrections are also important. I talked a little bit about the intelligent fusion already. Multilateral sharing arrangements. As we've done our international sharing, what we've found is that everything's bilateral, first of all. The way we do international sharing, it's a blind biometric. You send a fingerprint with a unique identifier, and we say, yes, we know who that person is, or no. If we say no, we're done. If we say yes, then we can share the identity information, and I say, I know him as Jim Smith, and you say, oh, he told me he was Roy Friedman. And then you try to figure out, is that a problem? Or was there some legitimate reason for him to do that? What we're finding is that some countries will ask a couple of countries, do you know this person? And the United States might say, yes, we know them, and another country might say no, and then and the person goes to that other countries. How do we make sure that other country gets that information, since we know you have an interest in it? You just didn't ask the right question. And so we're having those discussions now with a couple of our partners. Rapid deployment and new capabilities. 2 months seems long to some of our agencies right now. I have one particular agency who thinks I should be able to do things within 2 or 3 days. Technically you can do that. Do you want to do that? Does that give you time to review what the actual impacts are to your system, to privacy, to other issues, is the question. I talked about the identity data already. Vendor agnostic. We do not want to repeat the mistakes of the past where we had such a high investment in hardware or particular software that it just is not feasible to ever go away from that again. Our new system will allow us to add in through a biometric engine marketplace new vendors for both testing and for production, so that we're not locked in again, and we can take advantage of new technology as it comes about, even if it's open source. The robust filtering. We have robust filtering now, but it's hard-coded into the system. Our new system will give us a GUI approach to it so that we can actually set it. I hate the fact that I tell the contractor what I want people to see, and I have to believe that they inputted that correctly. And occasionally I have to ask for certain audits in order to make sure. I want to be able to look at the system myself and see that everything is set correctly, and to be able to pull messages in the data stream and actually review them on a daily basis. And then finally, person centricity. We have all these different systems in the government. We believe that our officers should not have to search 45 different databases that are used by our screening agencies. And so we're having a department-wide discussion on how many of those can be linked together. A lot of privacy and legal applications to that, but we want to be in the position of, if not aggregating that information on request, at least being able to provide links to all those different places. And with that, I will stop and ask you if you have any questions. In the back. There are no Department of Homeland Security applications that currently collect in the wild. That's the question about collecting in the wild. Our Customs and Border Protection folks are looking at that as a future evolution for airports. There are all sorts of issues with collecting in the wild, as you know. It makes it simpler for them to do their job. It reduces the number of officers. It identifies people before they get to the gate. But are we ready to do that? Is our citizenry ready to do that? I'm not so sure. When I travel to Europe, they always beat me up about the U.S. approach to privacy. And what I tell them is, you guys have got us wrong. We care deeply about privacy. We just come from a different place than Europe does. We don't have that history of the national government collecting information and using it against their own citizens in World War II. At the same time, we are aghast at the on-the-street, in the wild collection that occurs in some European cities. So it's your perspective. We think that that's outrageous. They think that our approach has problems. But in the wild is going to require a lot of effort before we move there. We're doing a pilot. The question is about relating to DNA. We're doing a pilot right now with our Science and Technology Directorate to figure out how we would do DNA. DNA is collected in kind of a small scale right now for familial connections at the border. When you have an unaccompanied minor, somebody shows up and claims they're the uncle. We want to make sure that you're related to that person before we release that child, because there have been bad examples of of human smuggling and trafficking type things. So they use it for that. We're now looking at, is there a use case for storing that data and using it in the future? The technology people say, well, of course. I'm on the business side, and I say, you haven't told me why I would need to retain that information for a couple years and search it again in some future point. Having said that, we're working on the technology so that if the policy is eventually worked out, we'll be able to do that. The other thing I tell the DNA people is stop trying to teach me about DNA. In the end, for me, it's a 24-digit alphanumeric string. I don't care how you derived it, whether it's rapid DNA, laboratory DNA, or if you made it up. I'm storing a 24-digit alphanumeric, and you just have to tell me how close does it have to be a yes to you.
I want to ask, is it working? There's a lot of research in cryptography on computing on encrypted data using secret sharing, homomorphic encryption, etc. And this can give you much higher degree of protection for the database because it gives not only perimeter defense but also an in-house defense. Are you thinking of incorporating these things, or is it just too slow for the numbers you're processing?
Well, we've been lucky in that our current system has always been within a government data center. So we take advantage of all of that perimeter, all of their firewalls, and then we have our own. Having said that, the Department of Homeland Security requires data at rest to be encrypted. So we are encrypted. I know there are better, newer encryption methods, and we are looking at those.
Do you share information with companies in the private sector?
No. We're currently working on a policy, though, with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the guys who manage nuclear power plants in the United States. And their problem is that nuclear power plants are operated by private companies who have a need to do recurrent vetting on their employees to make sure that they're not getting access to nuclear facilities. In the past, our position has always been we will share with the government agency, and then they're going to have to tell the vendor whether or not they can do that. We're revisiting that, and the lawyers are telling us that there's a little bit of flexibility. We're not sure how much, but in general, we don't do that. We are talking to a number of different government agencies, and one of our goals, we seek to be the biometric providers for all of the U.S. government outside of the criminal and defense areas. So Social Security Administration, the people who handle retirement, Medicare, all of if they have a need for it, we believe it's better to have one consolidated database. And I know there's some debate about this, that we can protect and put all of the assets into protecting rather than allowing this data to be strewn about in different ways. For example, the DNA information that is collected right now, you would find in paper files all over the United States. We don't like that, but the companies become a problem, particularly since that's not what we said we were collecting the information for.
In this country, there was a lot of controversy when the government started requiring fingerprints for passport and national identity applications for its own citizens. Will the U.S. start requiring fingerprints for its own citizens for passports?
I don't know. There's this thing in the United States that I can't really explain, that anytime somebody talks about a national police force, that's a no-go, even though we have multiple national police forces. If you talk about a national ID card, you will get voted out of office, even though we have a national ID, which is our Social Security number. It's just a U.S. thing that they're not willing to talk about certain things. Having said that, the Customs and Border Protection for their biometric exit program at airports that they're working now are collecting face on U.S. citizens, and that's become a sticking point for them. And they may have to come up with an option for U.S. citizens just because they may not be able to get that permanent rule through. There's a lot of culture to these things. Thank you all.